Adam Bandt, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
Should Australia host more US Marines in the Northern Territory?
No, it would make Australia less safe. I'm worried that with a government that's behind in the polls, they're gearing up for a khaki election. They're not doing that well. They've stuffed up the vaccine rollout. They've put a 4-year-old refugee in hospital. There's probably not much lower you can go on refugee policy after that. And so straight out of the Conservative playbook, they're now talking up the prospect of military engagement with China. And I think we need to be crystal clear. A war with China would be catastrophic.
A war with China, though, are they?
Well, the talk about increasing military preparation and potentially engagement, which we've heard from senior members of the government and the bureaucracy over recent times, is the kind of talk that escalates conflict. And you heard Scott Morrison earlier on saying, about a week ago, saying the template for him is looking at what happened after World War II, saying we need to relate to China the way that we related to other countries post-World War II. That took the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. That is a very bad blueprint. This kind of talk leads towards more conflict. What we should be trying to do is de-escalate.
I want to come back to some of those specifics you raised there, but just on the idea of more US Marines in the top end. The Greens, back in 2011, when Julia Gillard and Barack Obama negotiated this rotation of Marines in the top end, the Greens were worried about it, sceptical about it. Can I just ask, I mean, your party has long been wary of getting too close to the United States. Is that still your view, given the changing strategic environment? Are you worried about getting even closer in a defence relationship with the US?
Well, I'm worried that Australia just does whatever the US asks rather than doing what is in Australia's own interests. And that's the concern. The relationship with the United States is important and will continue to be an important relationship for Australia. So is the relationship with other countries. And I think we need to assess it on the basis of not what the United States wants, but what's in Australia's interests. Now,
and have those Marines in the top end been a problem over the last 10 years, do you think?
Well, I think the problem is how it's, in part, is what it means for our place in the region and how it is perceived. And if we are talking about increased militarisation in Australia, the question is, will that make Australia more or less safe? And I think it will make Australia less safe. I think the idea that at the moment, as you're seeing rising tensions between the US and China, Australia's got to make a decision about what role it wants to play there.
What should that decision be? Because I'm interested in your view on China, because you've been critical of China's behaviour in Hong Kong. You've even accused it of genocide in relation to the Uyghur population. How should we approach China?
Well, for years the Greens have been consistent, and I mean, maybe it's turning out that Liberal and Labor selling off the farm to China over the last 20, 30 years and turning a blind eye to human rights abuses while the money was rolling in from the mining boom wasn't such a flash idea. I mean, let's remember it's only a couple of years ago that Liberal and Labor said we should sign the China Free Trade Agreement that gives Chinese state-owned companies, government state-owned companies, the right to sue the Australian government, and opens up loopholes in our labour laws that you can fly plane loads of exploited overseas workers. So how should we approach
China now, though, given what we're seeing under Xi Jinping?
Consistency on human rights, but also, and I think when you are consistent, when you don't be silent while the money's coming in and then find a newfound concern when Donald Trump asks you to, if you're consistent on human rights, then you'll be more respected.
You don't think accusing them of genocide is only going to aggravate them further?
No, I think it's important to be principled and to be consistent and to not just do it when it's perceived to be in one's political interests. And I think that's part of the reason. I think Scott Morrison is still reading from the Donald Trump briefing notes. And I think that is part of the reason that we're finding ourselves in the position that we're in. But also, I mean, you have a look at what some of the Europeans are saying. There's a call for greater cooperation between China and the US and an understanding that we need to de-escalate. And I think that's in Australia's interests as well. And so I think to the extent that Australia needs to be working with other countries, yes, we need to be working with the US, but we also need to be working with those other countries, including in Europe, that are saying the time has come to de-escalate.
On climate change, it clearly is a big issue at this G7 summit as well, and Australia's not committed to the net zero by 2050 target. Do you think the European Union and others should actually hit Australia with carbon tariffs?
I think that's probably going to be inevitable, and I think it won't just be the European Union. I think it would be the US is looking at it as well. I wouldn't be surprised if the UK gets on board with it as well.
I guess what I'm asking is, would you welcome that?
If it was part of a move to say countries that aren't putting a price on pollution or making their polluters pay and aren't taking significant climate action need to have that recognised, then yes, I would.
Isn't that a bit strange, though, for an Australian politician to say we should be hit with tariffs?
I'm saying that the renewable energy industry in Australia and the industries that could provide export potential in a zero carbon world, like green hydrogen, need some support. And if Australia's not going to do it, then it is not fair for the rest of the world that is taking action on climate that will ultimately protect Australia to put companies that are doing the right thing at a disadvantage because Australia is bankrolling coal and gas. And you're right, climate is a critical issue at this G7. It is the only game in town. When they sit down to discuss climate, Scott Morrison will be sitting at the kids' table, and I think part of the reason he's been invited to this summit is so that the rest of the world can give Australia a dressing down on climate. I mean, you now have Boris Johnson and Joe Biden saying the things that the Greens have been saying. Boris Johnson just said, we are facing climate catastrophe, including more bushfires, and we have to phase out dirty coal. Now, those are his words. Joe Biden is talking about climate as an existential threat. And it's not 2050 that's the main game, it's 2030. They've tweaked that we've only got 10 years to sort this out. And I think Scott Morrison is going to come under enormous pressure because it's not just this climate denialism from Liberal and the backing of coal and gas from Labor isn't just a recipe for diplomatic isolation, it's a recipe for climate collapse.
Vaccines is another big issue at the G7. There's a push for wealthy developed countries to donate about 1 billion doses of COVID vaccine to developing countries. Australia will be committing some 20 million doses to some of our regional neighbours. The question is, when should we do that? And should we, instead of using vaccines for healthy, younger Australians, donate some of those to more vulnerable, older people in developing countries?
Well, I don't think it should be an either or, and part of the way that you can deal with that is increasing supply. And a big part of the problem has been that we've failed to fast-track manufacturing in Australia, especially of the mRNA.
But we are where we are, right? So now, what should we do now?
Well, now we should get on board and fast-track publicly owned mRNA vaccine manufacturing here, so that we can manufacture all the kinds of vaccines that we need.
To be able to do that will take quite some time.
Well, the best time to start was probably a few months ago. The second best time is now. And if we start now, then we're going to be in a position to be able to look after our region as well as look after people here.
But for this year, we should keep doing what we're doing, use the vaccines for Australians, even younger, healthier Australians, in your view, rather than send them to PNG or, in addition to what we're doing?
Well, again, I don't think it should be an either or. It's only posed as an either or if you haven't got supply and domestic manufacturing capacity.
We don't have supply.
But that can be fixed, and that's my point. And the question is, what does the government want to put its foot on the accelerator for? And I think it should. The strategy so far of hoping that big overseas drug corporations will look on us favourably and bump us up the queue hasn't worked, and we've got to fast-track domestic manufacture. And if we need to, in order to look after our region, we need to go back to some of the drug corporations and get behind Joe Biden's push, for example, to have greater liberalisation of access of some of these drugs. That's what we should do.
Melbourne has just emerged the other day from another 2-week lockdown. Your family will be well aware of that as well, being based here. A lot of debate about how to avoid another lockdown, how far we need to be with the rollout of vaccines. Do you have a view on where we should be with the vaccine rollout to avoid something like this again?
Well, closer to where America is rather than where we are at the moment. I mean, in America, they had Donald Trump in charge of managing their pandemic response for the first few months. And in about 4 months, Joe Biden has managed to get about 50% of the adult population vaccinated, and Scott Morrison can't crack 5%. Now, in Melbourne, hearts are heavy, and shoulders have been slumped because we've gone back into another lockdown, and it is the Morrison lockdown because this escaped a quarantine facility in another state, and it landed on a heavily unvaccinated population, and in quarantine, vaccinations, but also in aged care and disability care, all of these areas that were the government's responsibility, they have failed to do what they promised to do.
If this is the Morrison lockdown, for the reasons you articulate, are you saying if we were at 50%, population vaccinated, we would not need a lockdown?
I'd be guided by the health experts on that, but the message that they've given very clearly is that the risk of it spreading and the risks of transmission are dramatically reduced, and that's why part of the reason that we're doing this. Yes, it's to keep people out of hospital, but yes, it's also to grow immunity. And the problem has been that vaccinations have been needed in so many places, and they haven't been there. I mean, this was Scott Morrison's job. The people who've been breathing down his neck saying we want to reopen Australia, they are also calling for a faster vaccination rollout. Why hasn't it happened?
You mentioned the Biloela family earlier, the McGarpin family. Look, there's some pressure within the government for them to be resettled in Australia now. You've been pushing for this for quite some time. Can I ask, do you think this should be the approach for asylum seekers who have children born in Australia? Should this be the general policy approach to resettle them here? You should be allowed to stay if your kids are born here, or is it just a one-off?
Well, I think the one-offs are critical in this instance, but generally what this has shown is that Australia's refugee policy is built on putting 4-year-olds in hospital. It is based on systematic cruelty towards people who come here seeking our help. And the big part of the reason that we're in this situation where this young girl had to be transferred to hospital in a very serious condition was because of offshore detention. Now, Liberal and Labor, if this family arrived today under Liberal or Labor, they would be sent offshore to mandatory detention. And it is that needs to change. So, yes, we can have a debate about whether we should change whether we should give an exception to the rules.
Just because the question was, if you're an asylum seeker and you have kids born in Australia, should you be allowed to stay?
Well, if you're an asylum seeker, you should be able to come to Australia, have your claim assessed not while you're in mandatory detention, but while you're living in the community.
And if you're
assessed, then, well, I think kids, it's obviously an important factor. If you have children who are born here, then I think that is an important factor.
But they should all be,
one of the things that's going through the courts at the moment is what is the rights of someone who is born here. Now, the law...
So I guess I'm asking your view. Do you think you should be able to stay if you're an asylum seeker and you have kids here?
Yeah, I think you should be able to stay, but I think we need a broader rethink, because what this particular case has shown is that Australia's refugee policy, backed by Liberal and Labor, is based on putting people like this in effective prisons. And the point that I want to make is this: if they came here again today, both Liberal and Labor would send them offshore, and we would be back having this debate time after time after time again, and we need to end mandatory detention.
Out of Bandt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.